Why do we become insulin resistant, and how do we become, like, if it's the same thing? Can you delve into that for me?
Yeah, that's the $1,000,000 question. So this is what I dove into, and I tried to steel man both arguments. That's what it's called, where you try to find like the best exemplar of different perspectives. So this is really easy in the case of the first perspective, which is much more common and which I see all the time in the natural and alternative health world. So the basic theory about insulin resistance that you'll normally find if you look it up, if you buy the average book about it, if you watch a YouTube about it, if you read an article about it, is this. Human beings these days are eating far too many carbs and far too many simple carbs. We're not adapted to it for a long time, maybe hundreds of thousands or millions of years. We had very few carbs available to us. Until agriculture, maybe 10,000-ish years ago, roughly, depending on your ancestors. We didn't have access to agriculture. So carbs were few and far between for most of our ancestors throughout most of our human civilization. Now we've got loads. Not only have we got agriculture, but we've got industry, we've got unlimited supply of food, all these things. And so that's unnatural. This is their perspective, the low-carb people. And so the other issue is that we're not moving as much as we used to. We used to walk 4 to 6 hours a day on average. That's hunter-gatherer, times. And then since, agricultural, industrial revolution, agricultural first, we still would have moved a hell of a lot more than now. And even with the industrial revolution, there was still a lot of, lifting things and moving things and all the rest of it. And so the idea of a desk-bound job where you just sit down all the time is very, very unusual for the vast majority of our history. Even, kings and queens and all the rest of it, well, you might say that the aristocracy got to just sit around, but actually they were at war all the time and they were constantly training for war. So, and they were doing sports and hunting and all the rest of it. So everyone had to move, and the few who didn't have to still chose to, until recently. So that's the other part of it. Why does that matter? Because the two main places that your body stores sugar, glucose, in the form of glycogen is in your liver and in your muscles. And the muscles is the main place, even though the liver is kind of in charge of it. Like there's more in your muscles than anywhere else. And so when you exercise, you deplete all that glucose in the form of glycogen in your muscles. And then when you have more glucose in the form of carbs, the insulin transports it into your muscle cells again. Now, if you never deplete your muscles because you never really push yourself that hard, then when you next have carbs, your insulin will go up, but there's like nowhere for it to go because you haven't depleted the muscles because you haven't exercised. That's the theory behind that. And I'm saying with all these, that's the theory, but there's some degree of truth to everything I'm saying. We're just going to work out how much it is. And then the other issue, of course, is too frequent eating. The argument would go that, again, throughout most of our human history, food was not a guarantee, right? As hunter-gatherers, which again is most of our evolution, there would be times where there was no food. And so we would be fasting, especially during winter, whatever. And so it's not natural to have a constant supply of food. That's how the argument would go. And so again, it's the same thing. When there's sometimes no food, your body will deplete those stores of glycogen in your muscles and in your liver, and it also deplete the stores of energy in the form of fat in your fat cells. And then when you do consume some calories, some carbs, the insulin will have plenty of places to put it. All right. So this is, I think, an easy to understand theory, and I think that's why it's become very popular.
So just quickly, just so I'm understanding it correctly, what I'm hearing you say is essentially we need to deplete the glucose that we have in our systems so that we're ready for more. It's like we can't stuff more into that suitcase if it's already full.
Yes, that's how the theory goes. I'd say it's to sum it up as simply as possible. The problem is we're having way more carbs, way more frequently than we used to do before, and we're using up way less than we ever have before. That's what they would say. And there's definitely, obviously, some truth to every statement I've made, right? All of these things are true to some degree. And so because of that, the advice is really simple, based on the three things I just said. We're eating more carbs than ever before. Stop that. That's the advice for that, right? Eat a ketogenic diet. Have most of your calories come from fat, maybe MCT especially, easy ketones, easy forms of energy. Okay, not enough exercise? Stop that. Start exercising more. And then too frequent eating, stop that, start fasting, start doing intermittent fasting. That's really popular with this kind of community. And so the reason why that strategy works, even if there's something missing from it, is because it's kind of like, to me, it's a brute force way of forcing the insulin down. Because yeah, if you hardly ever have hardly any carbohydrates, then the chances that your body will produce so much insulin that it becomes excessive obviously will be less. And if you go for extended periods without eating, then that means that you're going for an extended period without any reason for your body to release insulin. And so even if you have a backlog of insulin, your body would slowly clear that because you're not doing anything to stimulate it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. That absolutely does, yeah.
Okay. And it is quite an easy theory to understand. It makes sense, even intuitively, and I think that's why it's caught on and become really, really popular. However, it doesn't necessarily explain why some people do better on a high carbohydrate diet with very little fat. And it also, to me, a certain thing is lacking, that a lot of people do feel great on a ketogenic diet and it's revolutionary for them and they feel so much healthier and they have so much more energy and they lose weight and they resolve their high insulin and all the rest of it. Maybe they resolve their high blood sugar. But there are plenty of other people who have quite a bad experience with it. For various different reasons.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I don't know if we have time to go into that here, but, could you elaborate on that?
When I explain the other theory, that should hopefully make more sense.
Perfect, okay.
But yeah, I'll just say that the people who, are following that, the good thing is that it works when you stick to it, so long as you can stick to it, and not everyone can. The bad news is that, from my perspective, it's not really resolving the problem. The proof of that being, as soon as you start eating carbs again, your insulin is not now controlled, because the very premise you're working with is that I should not be eating carbs. And so if you start eating them again, of course your insulin is going to go up. Of course you're going to have insulin resistance and high blood sugar. So some people say it's not a problem to me, Elwin. I've been eating keto 20 years. I feel great. I lost loads of weight. I'm healthy. All my blood reports are saying I'm healthy. In which case, great, right? Go with it. If you are happy not eating carbs for the rest of your life, genuinely, and I'm not being facetious, some people are, then great, right? Good for you. There is a challenge, of course, which is that in order to, as I talked about a lot in the last episode, your body needs glucose in order to create energy. And so in order to get enough energy when you eat no carbs, your body has to make carbs out of amino acids, and it has to make it out of fats indirectly via triglycerides, but it has to make it out of fats. So one way or another, it's getting glucose. Now, in order for your body to get that glucose that it wants out of amino acids and fats, the only way it can do that is for your stress chemicals to be high, for your cortisol and noradrenaline. At least, we're going to talk about others later on that I've got prepared, but at least those have to be high.
And for health purposes and health reasons, it's going against the things that we want, because if we're spiking and we're putting more stress in the system, even though we may not be feeling stressed, but our body's going through the process, that's counterproductive to the things we want, right?
It's counterproductive to some of them. And this is why I'm saying I kind of want to steel man that argument. So, because as I said, some people are like, oh, when I've been keto for 20 years, I lost weight, my cardiovascular disease went away, you're telling me it's wrong? No, I'm not. Right? Because it's about balance. So is having chronically high cortisol and noradrenaline bad? Yes. Is having chronically high insulin, what they call insulin resistance, potentially worse? Yes. Chronically high insulin will prematurely age you arguably as much or more than chronically high cortisol. And so that's why some people do better. Now, remember, everyone's different genetically. We've talked before in different episodes about the COMT gene. Some people break down stress chemicals quite easily and quickly, and some people break it down very slowly and with difficulty, and some people are in between. So I suspect that for the person who breaks down stress chemicals very easily and quickly, that they have less issues with the ketogenic approach, because the stress chemicals never build up, too much. I mean, they're going to be high, but they're not going to be too high necessarily, because their body will keep breaking them down. For other people who have a tendency to either really spike stress chemicals excessively, which I believe I have, or if you have a tendency to not break them down very easily, then that can be one of the reasons, to answer your earlier question, why the keto diet will not seem to work for you.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, that's a lot. So then going into my next part of this really is, I mean, I understand the process about we have to clear out the glucose so that there's more space, because if something's already full, you can't put any more in it. And I understand that the insulin is rising and rising to do the job better, not do the job better, but to try and do its job if things are already full. So then, and you discuss the parts of, the not moving, not exercising, and the, too frequent eating and things like that. But what else would cause a person's body to be or to have insulin resistance?
So as I said, that's one theory about the cause of it. Now, what I don't like about it is what you just said, that it's predicated on keeping stress chemicals high in order to function. It's also predicated on having a very restrictive diet. And it's predicated on this idea that carbohydrates are bad, which I do not think is necessarily true. So here's the other theory on it. The other theory is that what's actually causing the insulin resistance is not excessive carbohydrate, lack of exercise, lack of fasting, but what's causing it is that actually 3 very small particles of fat floating around in the bloodstream are starting to get into the cells and block the insulin from being able to transport the glucose into them. So this theory, the previous theory, the best exponent of it that I came across was a guy called Ben Bikman. I think he's great. I can't remember the name of his book, but something like What Causes All Disease. It's like a big claim, but he does a very good job of making a case of everything that I just said, and also all the terrible things that insulin does to the body, which I think he's largely correct about. But he's very much in the keto camp. Now, the other camp, the best exponent of it I've found so far is Ray Peat, who we've talked about before. So this is what Ray Peat would say. He would say that when the insulin starts to drop, and we talked about this in the last episode, keeping insulin not too high, but not too low either, keeping it at the right level is the thing that is most important for health. It's very easy to be simplistic about this stuff and start to go, well, high insulin is bad, so I want to get my insulin as low as possible. Now, by the way, I'm not saying this to justify my own insulin. When I recently did a fasting insulin test, my insulin was like so low that actually, by Ray Peat's theory, it's maybe not ideal. So I'm not saying this to judge to justify my own position, but this is the theory. So the theory is that when the insulin drops too low because you haven't had enough carbohydrates, completely opposite view, your body does lipolysis, and it does gluconeogenesis, which we talked about in the last episode. But basically, to simplify it, this process of breaking down fat and breaking down fat in the fat cells and breaking down protein in the muscles, as well as the process of trying to pull glycogen out of the muscles and liver. But it does that in addition. So there's not enough glucose coming in, it needs glucose. Your body needs a constant supply of glucose, right? So to review. So where's it going to get glucose from? It's got some in storage, but also it automatically, if there's not enough insulin presence, will start cannibalizing your muscles, and it will start cannibalizing your fat cells. Now, cannibalizing your muscles is obviously not a great thing. I just was listening to a thing about Ozempic today. I've given criticisms about it that are different from this, but I heard Dr. Peter Attia, I think, talking about how he found that when people are using Ozempic, yes, they lost weight, but their fat percentage actually went up, and it was more muscle mass that they were losing. And so this does not surprise me. The main thing that Ozempic does is it causes you to eat much less. And so when you eat much less, you're in this calorie deficient state. Your insulin is going to tend to be lower depending on what you're eating. And so your body, unfortunately, has this tendency to, because of this gluconeogenesis, pull amino acids from your muscles as one of its primary sources of fuel, often before it starts breaking down fat cells. So that's not good, because your muscles, as well as being, as you get older, like a crucial thing that will keep you alive, falls and breaks and stuff often take people out as they get older. But also your percentage of muscle to fat is one of the primary drivers of health, metabolic health. And this is actually something that both Ben Bickman and Ray Peat would agree on, that ratio is important, because muscle will tend to burn more energy than fat does. So something that breaks down muscle, a situation that breaks down muscle, is not ideal. But from Ray Peat's perspective, the worst thing actually is surprising, and it's breaking down the fat. Because when it breaks down fat in this particular way, it means that a lot of free fatty acids start floating around in the blood. Now, part of the issue here is what type of fat you have in storage. If you have saturated fats in storage, that's not great if they start to become free and released into the bloodstream, but it's not terrible. If you have a lot of omega-6 unsaturated fatty acids in storage in your fat cells, and then they get released and liberated into your bloodstream, this causes chronic inflammation. And this is one of the points, again, that these two opposing viewpoints agree on. They both agree that in omega-6 fatty acids, seed oils generally called, are highly inflammatory, contribute to insulin resistance, and make insulin resistance worse. So this is something that everyone can agree on. And one of the interesting things, this is a bit of a spoiler, but the people who are curing themselves with pure keto, or the people who are curing themselves with pure high carb, high glycemic carbs like baked potatoes or white rice or whatever, one thing that they have in common is that neither of them are having a lot of omega-6 or any omega-6s. So reducing omega-6s seems to be the thing, or one of the things that everyone can agree on, which will help for insulin resistance. Now, of course, omega-6s also suppress thyroid function. That's one of the mechanisms by which they work. And so imagine this. 100 years ago, I haven't verified this, but I saw article recently that said like the average calorie intake for people 100 years ago was 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day. They weren't necessarily particularly active, because we're talking about 100 years ago, not 200-300 years ago. They were eating quite a lot of sugar. So there goes the whole low-carb theory. That none of them were overweight or obese, pretty much. It was like exceptional situation. So what was different, And this is a bit of, I'm going to tell you that, several other things that are different now than they were 100 years ago, but this is the first one. Back then, the percentage of omega-6 fats in the diet was maybe 1 or 2% of calories. These days, it's 20 to 30% of calories. This makes a massive difference. So anyway, going back to what causes insulin resistance. So these free fatty acids are released into the bloodstream, and your body's attempts to free up some energy, because there's a lack of glucose, maybe a lack of calories in general coming in. Your body's in this fasted state. It's raising its stress chemicals. It's breaking down muscle tissue. It's liberating free fatty acids. And this is actually blocking the cells so that then the insulin resistor is not able to function properly. That's the theory behind it.
Okay, so I'm quite a visual in this way. And so what I'm seeing is that this free fatty acids flowing in the bloodstream. Can you explain how that's blocking the insulin from getting in? Is it just taking up space on receptor sites? Is it not allowing things to get through? Or could you dive into that for me? Yeah,
the most I understand this is that it is blocking the receptor.
Okay.
Exactly right. And that the omega-6 blocks it more. Remember, every cell, this is a bit complicated, but it's got this like a cell membrane. It's got a phospholipid, which is a kind of type of fat. It's got saturated fats all around it. So it really doesn't take much to reduce the permeability of the cell to the point that it's no longer sufficiently permeable for the insulin to get in. I don't know if I don't understand it of any more detail than that, or if actually anyone understands it in any more detail than that, because that's as far as I have been able to get to. But what people have observed is that, well, yeah, let me get to that. So to me, this could explain why there are people who take diets of, as I said, high carbohydrate, no fat. One of versions of that I came across a long time ago, back when I was a vegan, was fruitarians, right? So they're absolutely people who eat 100% only fruit, who cure their type 2 diabetes, who cure their insulin resistance, right? How is that possible? Well, I've given you one theory already. No omega-6 fats in fruit, except for, I'm trying to think, even the fatty fruits, avocado, there's not much, olive, there's not much. So yeah, there is none. So that's one theory as to why that could actually work, right? Now, the other thing, of course, is that elevating stress and elevating omega-6s causes inflammation and causes suppressed thyroid function. Thyroid function, as we know, is essential for the cell to function, the mitochondria within the cells to function in general. So I think that is a part of it as well, and that's why that could explain why the insulin resistance often correlates with people gaining weight, especially gaining fat.
Okay, then this is going to throw this out there. I might have some people say, yeah, but I'm supposed to have fats for the health of my cell membranes and things like that. But you're talking about a specific type of fat, correct?
Well, not the fruitarian is not, right? So they're just saying don't have any fat other than maybe, a couple of olives or something like that. As I said, there are extremes on both sides, right? There are people who say no carbs and they cure themselves of diabetes. And then there are people who say only carbs and they cure themselves of diabetes. And so I'm trying to understand how both of those things are possible. And this is what I'm trying to explain, how it's possible, right? So now, if we go back to the other theory, the keto theory, how does that make sense then? Well, because obviously with the keto diet, you're flooding your blood supply with these free fatty acids, which are blocking the uptake of insulin. But of course, you're not taking any carbs and you're depleting the glycogen storage in your muscles and your liver on a regular basis by fasting or exercising. And so even though you have blocked the uptake of insulin with this strategy, it doesn't matter because you're not stimulating insulin because you're not having the carbs. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you haven't resolved the problem. You have merely made it irrelevant because sure, I've blocked my cells from taking up, insulin effectively with all these free fatty acids. But you know what? I'm hardly stimulating any insulin because I'm not eating any carbohydrates. So that's fine. It's no problem. Like, in order to have enough insulin, that insulin resistance is a problem, you have to have carbohydrates to stimulate that much insulin. Like protein will stimulate a bit of insulin, some of the amino acids like leucine and arginine. Sweet flavors like artificial sweeteners will stimulate a little bit of insulin. But as Ben Bickman says, like all these are hardly anything as long as you're not having carbs. So very little insulin is secreted. And so it's never going to build up to the point of insulin resistance, even if you are blocking the ability of your cells to uptake insulin effectively with the free fatty acids because you're never stimulating insulin in the first place. So that's how both those theories could be true at the same time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. Yeah, I'm understanding it a little bit more. I mean, so what you're saying about within the keto, and I'm going to use an analogy and you can tell me if it's correct, is there's a stain on the carpet, but yet if I move the couch over the carpet, nobody's going to see it. So I've kind of fixed the stain, sort of.
So long as you don't move that carpet, basically,
couch,
yeah.
Okay.
I don't want anyone to take this simplistically and go, oh, Elwin, okay, what you just said makes sense. I will now stop eating keto and start eating carbs. Because what would you think would happen if you do that, right? Think about it. I've just said that by eating a high keto, low-carb diet for ages, you've made yourself more insulin resistant. If you then start eating a load of carbohydrates, will that fix the issue? No, it's going to make you worse, right? You're going to put on weight, you're going to your insulin's going to be too high. It's going to cause all the other issues. It's going to cause, I got a list. I guess you're going to ask me about that later. But
well, yeah, hold that one. With these two theories that are essentially different, can you summarize it for us just with a nice little bow and essentially kind of wrap it up for us in what they agree on?
Yeah, in terms of what they agree on, it's pretty simple. So one thing I've really talked about, everyone who effectively resolves this is against large amounts or really any, ideally, omega-6 fatty acids. So that's seed oil, right? Soy oil, corn oil, but even the ones that are supposed to be healthy, sunflower oil, safflower oil. The repeat camp would actually say even omega-3s, especially the seeds. So, flaxseed oil, hemp seed oil, and all the rest of it, are all having that effect. The other camp, the keto camp, is probably not as against the omega-3s. They may even be for them. But what they agree on is the omega-6s are bad news. They are pro-inflammatory, and they increase insulin resistance by reducing insulin sensitivity. Now, another big factor that they actually both agree on is that stress makes insulin resistance worse. Now, the fact that they both agree on that, and yet the keto camp recommends a type of eating which artificially keeps stress chemicals high, sounds like a little bit of a contradiction to me. But still, fundamentally, if that works for you, as we talked about earlier, and you do your best to keep your stress chemicals low otherwise, I can see how that's a strategy that could potentially work for you and that you would feel better with it, right? So they both agree to keep omega-6 as low as possible. They both agree to keep stress as low as possible. It's just, from my perspective, it's not possible to keep your stress as low as possible when you're constantly in a state of ketosis. But whatever. Hey, I hope you enjoyed that clip from the Rejuvenate podcast. If you want to watch the full episode that came from, just click on the link above. Or if you just want to watch our latest video, then click the link below. And make sure that you subscribe to the channel and like the video. Thank you.